Here's something we hear all the time. If only more people knew about environmental problems, then they would certainly act in some ecologically beneficial way. The problem is, it's not true. We're now deluged with data about the climate crisis, and yet this abundance of available environmental information has not led to an abundance of environmental action. This deficit model of climate communication is flawed, even though scientists, environmentalists, and other proponents of climate action continue to speak and act as if people would do more if they just knew more about the climate crisis and understood the science of climate change. Heather Hauser writes about environmental ideas and themes in art, literature, culture, and the humanities. Her work blossoms with keen insights about the importance of culture in confronting ecological crisis.
I mean, especially if you are an environmentalist, you pay attention to these issues, but really, even if you're not, there's a lot, just so much like information coming at us about, say, the percentage of extinct mammals, right? How many mammal species are extinct or bird species are extinct? All the data about climate crisis, whether it's like warming temperatures, ocean acidification, how much of the ice sheet has melted, it's all this data.
It's like, how do you make sense of that?
Yeah, what do you do with that? I mean, what do you do with that not only as a way to understand the phenomena at maybe a, objective or straightforward level, but what do you do with that emotionally if you're an artist or communicator?
I'm John Fiege, and this is Chrysalis. Heather Hauser is professor of English at the University of Texas at Austin. I met her many years ago in Austin when I was developing a film about dance and environmental justice. Heather's both a dancer and an environmental humanities scholar. Our conversation explores climate information overload, the idea of what she calls eco-sickness in literature, the thorny topic of human population size, and whether artists should reject or rework artistic tools of the past that might be tainted by colonialism, racism, or other forms of oppression. Here is Heather Hauser. So I'd like to start with an essay you're working on about your childhood, which you shared with me. In this piece, you talk about the instability of your upbringing, from your parents' rocky marriage to their financial woes, and the constant moves that resulted. You moved about 13 times in your childhood, largely around the Poconos region of Pennsylvania, I think, and to other states as well. In the midst of that instability and constant shifting ground, as you call it, you found a sense of stability, grounding, and joy in dance. You write, "At this age, I hadn't yet met the idea of the plateau or of the precipitous fall. This was the time for the joy of movement, the satisfactions of devotion, and a belief that the alchemy of body, space, music, and time can make you other than who you are and where you came from." I love this idea of seeing your childhood and who you became through this lens of dance. Can you talk more about where you come from and maybe what your relationship to the rest of nature was as a child, and how this alchemy of body, space, music, and time led to your interest in the environment?
Yeah, thank you. So I was born in the Poconos region of Pennsylvania, which is in the northeast part of the state, right along the New Jersey border. And if you know it at all, you likely know it as a tourist destination for urbanites. When this was, I should say, I was born there in 1979 and grew up there with one gap when I lived in the Massachusetts, but I lived there from 1979 to 1997. So I think things have changed, but back then it was certainly, there were a lot of resorts, honeymoon destinations, summer camps. So a large tourist influx from New York and New Jersey and Philadelphia. But then there were the locals like myself. So it was a place of abundant nature, I would say. The Appalachian Trail ended and started there. Lots of lakes. It's a hardwood forest area, lots of ponds and creeks, or as I say in that essay, cricks, my Grammy and Pappy said. I didn't pick that up, but that's what parts of my family called creeks.
Uh-huh.
But that was actually not my family's orientation. So I lived in this place with so many things I now wish were right outside my
Right.
door. And of course,
Right.
Austin, Texas has its own beautiful environments, but I honestly did none of that. I mean, there was one swimming hole we would go to called the 40-foot.
Mhm.
There was a 40-foot jump, which I
Mhm.
did not do because I was afraid of
Mhm.
heights. But I don't remember swimming in the lakes or the creeks. Aside from that, we never went on hikes except for maybe, walks in the woods near our house, or houses, since there were many of them. So that relationship that I now have, like the appreciation and really the need to be outside, um, is something that developed really in my college years when I lived in Portland, Oregon. Um, when I think about dance in the environment personally, in my relation to it is about movement. Being able to move in space, I think, is one of the continuities from my dance persona to my, like, environmental appreciation,
Mhm.
and even though those were
Mhm.
completely divorced, or separate just didn't really exist when I was a kid, I feel that continuity now.
Right. Right. And, when you were in the Poconos area as a child, did you have a did you have a sense of people from the cities coming there as, like, a location of nature and looking for this kind of pristine wilderness experience? Did you have a sense of that?
Oh, absolutely, and, I mean, this is I was very hard on the place when I lived there. I mean, I really wanted out. I went almost as far as you could go within the continental United States, when I went to college, kind of foolishly to go to a private liberal arts college across the country, but it worked
Uh-huh.
out okay in the end. But I did not I mean, I definitely knew that people were coming to the Poconos for that experience of nature and wilderness, and, you would quite honest, I interacted a lot with tourists because I worked at an ice cream shop, so, one of those time-honored things
Yeah.
you do on a summer
How
vacation is go to
iconic.
the ice cream shop. Yeah, but, I was there. Not stuck there. I wouldn't say that because I did like that job and my bosses and coworkers, so I didn't feel stuck, but certainly a different experience, and so I had a lot of contact with tourists that way, but really never befriended any tourists or had, um, deep interactions with them, but it was clear that was a big part of the experience was, something so drastically different from, say, New York City or Philadelphia, and, I mean, we used to kind of, make fun of or just roll our eyes at tourists sort of fascinated by the so-called wildlife that for us was much more domesticated, um we certainly had wildlife. We had bears that would come up. We lived in pretty remote even within the Poconos, pretty remote parts because there is, like, a downtown area that's a little bit denser, but we always lived outside of that, and we had bears that would walk up our driveway, and um, we had turkeys, like a turkey mound that they just hung out on, and,
Mhm.
these sorts of things. So there were some animals that were maybe even, felt a little bit wilder even to us, but, yeah, so we would just find it amusing that tourists would find things like foxes or, um, um, deer, like, really fascinating and even frightening, right? Like, these things that you're not used to seeing are often scary, even if there isn't much reason to be afraid of them. I wasn't taking as much advantage of what surrounded me as I would at this point in my life,
Mhm.
and, so in some sense, I think the people who are coming in maybe appreciated it more than I did because
Mhm.
it was such a stark difference from their day-to-day reality. Um, but of course, like most tourist destinations, it had its very, pretty detrimental effects, right? All that tourism.
Right, the development and the trash and the traffic.
Yeah, traffic and all of that.
Yeah. Well, let's fast forward to what you're doing now. So What are the environmental humanities, and how did you come to focus your work within that field?
Yeah, so the environmental humanities, I mean, it really encompasses a cluster of academic disciplines like history and literary studies and religious studies and anthropology. Often it can capture the arts too, creative arts. Um, but really, the that academic cluster aside, it's really the impetus behind the environmental humanities is a recognition that we can't understand human relationships to the more than human or nature as we typically call it. We really can't understand that through scientific or policy or economic approaches alone, that we need to also understand the cultural aspects of that. We need to understand the artistic aspects of human relationships to nature. So that's one dimension of that. Like, if we are going to understand human relationships to nature, which vary over time and across cultures, we really can't just rely on some quantitative analyses. But another dimension, I think, looking forward is if thinking especially of environmental issues, challenges, disasters, we also need those cultural, historical, and artistic understandings if we are going to really address these challenges, especially in an equitable manner. That, thinking about the history of, for example, um, climate policy, or thinking about the history of colonialism when we are thinking about how to respond to climate crisis today. We need those historical dimensions if we're going to move people. And this "we" is variable, right?
Right.
Like, it's not that there's a uniform um, across the environmental humanities. There's certainly not a uniform um, outcome that people have in mind. But if you're thinking about responses to, say, climate crisis or extinction, whatever it might be, that you need to also marshal all that cultural representation, all that artistic expression bring to the conversation, because that's really what moves people. It's what helps people imagine other futures and also to reflect on what brought us to the present. So it's really, historical, cultural, and artistic and expressive. And within the cultural, I also think of, spiritual and religious dimensions of environmental relation and responses.
Right.
You asked me how I came to this. I was an English major as an undergraduate and then took some time not in school, but when I went back to graduate school, I didn't know that that would be a focus. I actually thought I had lived in Portland, Oregon, and living there had become much more attuned to environmentalism, largely of an urban nature, but not necessarily exclusively. And also just became much more of an outdoors person, camping, backpacking, hiking, all of those things. Um, but I thought that was a part of my personal and political life and not part of my academic or
Right.
intellectual life.
Right.
But midway or so through my time in graduate school, you need to define your dissertation. And I really had two paths I was considering. And one was finding a way to merge my personal interest and commitments to environmentalism with my academic life. And I wasn't sure I wanted to do that, actually. I didn't have coursework in that area, but there was my advisor and a professor, Ursula Heise. That is her. She's really um, one of the most prominent people in the field of environmental humanities. So she was at Stanford where I went to grad school. So I certainly had someone to guide me, which she did amazingly. But yeah, it was a question for me of whether to keep certain spheres of my life separate or to try to bring them together. And I decided to bring them together.
And was that Was that a good decision in
Well,
retrospect?
the I made that decision because I thought that could carry me through some of those hard and dark times of being a graduate student, like, to sort of think about my commitments beyond the academic sphere. But it is challenging, in that it can feel like everything is a part of everything, um,
Right, right.
and, activism or serving on advisory groups or whatever it might be outside of the academic world, and suddenly it's not at all separate, right?
Mhm, mhm.
So I don't know. I think it served me well. There are weeks and days where it can feel, um, yeah, like there is no outside.
Well, I can feel the passion of it in how you write and what you write. So I think that's definitely the positive side of it. So your first book is called Eco Sickness in Contemporary US Fiction. So can you tell me what is eco sickness?
Yeah, so that idea is it's really capturing how often, environmental degradation or change and bodily, damage or change, how often those things go together. So there were a number of writers I was noticing, and I talk about Leslie Marmon Silko and Richard Powers, David Foster Wallace, among others. In their writing, they are taking stock of environmental damage in most cases in the literature that I was examining. And
Mhm,
at the same time, they're taking account of all of the transformations to bodies that are happening in the 21st century. And, I think in a more scientific register or even a more maybe environmental justice register, we often think of these as causal relationships, right? So there's a toxin that a polluting industry is releasing into the water, and people consume that, and then they experience maybe cancer or neurological change or infertility or reproductive changes. I think that causal relationship between the environment and the body is pretty prominent in our thinking of environmental health. But a lot of these authors weren't thinking so directly causally. It was more, they're interested in how we actually can conceptualize the environment and what's happening to it in terms of the body, and a body
mhm,
that's sick rather than a healthy body.
mhm,
Back in the 19th century in the US, with some of the white male like proto or early environmentalists like John Muir,
mhm,
um, um, Henry David Thoreau, that relationship between the environment and the body was also often one of health
mhm.
and robustness, and getting out into nature and climbing mountains, and sort of overcoming some of the challenges. But in the 21st century or late 20th century and 21st century, certainly that still exists, but we often have an understanding of the relationship between the body and the environment through sickness or
Right,
damage of some
right.
kind. So the book is like tracking how really that phenomenon, that it exists, and also then how it manifests very formally, artistically in a set of novels and memoirs.
Yeah, and you mentioned Rachel Carson as well, who's one of my favorite writers.
Yeah.
And she's known as a nonfiction writer, but,
Mhm.
I it made me think of the opening of Silent Spring, which is kind of written like fiction. I think you even referred to it that way. And so I wanted to read just a quick
Mhm.
section of that because I thought maybe I'd be curious to hear how you relate this to this idea of eco sickness.
Mhm.
So this is from the opening chapter in Silent Spring called The Fable of Tomorrow. So Rachel Carson writes, there was a strange stillness. The birds, for example, where had they gone? Many people spoke of them, puzzled and disturbed. The feeding stations in the backyards were deserted. The few birds seen anywhere were moribund. They trembled violently and could not fly. It was a spring without voices. So how does this passage in this book relate to this larger body of of eco-sickness literature. In this example, there's sickness in the body of the bird, not body of
Mhm.
human, but later in the book, she talks about it in the body of humans.
Rachel Carson is just an amazing writer. I mean, she's certainly probably most popularly known for Silent Spring, but her writings on the ocean are just amazing.
Mhm. Yeah,
And she calls that the fable for a reason, so she's already marking it as somewhat fictional, but of course, fables always point us to deeper truths.
right,
But Carson is really inspirational to me in that project of eco sickness, but also, um, she's really inspirational for thinking about this relationship between the environment and the body through illness, through rapid transformations that were unforeseen. Um, but that I also think that what's so, I mean, again, there's no causality in that opening, right? The rest of the book is explaining the mechanisms that and the sources of the death and disruption of bird populations among other animals, including humans. But in that opening, right, it's this more evocative feeling of the consequences. Like there's something out of joint here, right? There's no more bird song. We don't maybe yet know why, but
right,
we know that that's a problem. And I mean, I think one of the reasons that's so important for thinking about eco sickness or environmental health outside of strict causalities. That is like something that you can conclusively prove through empirical studies, scientific research, data, all of that. I think it's important to think outside of those because it takes a long time and sometimes it's even impossible to pin down causalities.
right,
And that feels really comforting, like, especially when you want redress, you want blame, you want compensation, you want a quick solution. But even before you get there, like to feel that something is wrong and not to ignore it, like that's something that opening I think really does powerfully as a an entree to the rest of the book, and like certainly does for my project of eco sickness. Like these authors aren't trying to directly explain how, say, depression results from a toxin. It's more thinking about, a toxic environment more broadly and how they coexist and have similar mechanisms and manifestations.
right. Well, Rachel Carson fits into the next thing I wanna talk to you about as well. I think one thing that makes her so powerful is she's a scientist, who's been trained as a scientist and really knows the science, and she's a brilliant writer, which is a really rare combination. And I love what you say in the opening of your book about the importance of literary and humanistic knowledge. You talk about how science illiteracy is no longer an option for humanists. But at the same time, you flip that to argue that narrative illiteracy is no longer an option for scientists or anyone who wants to confront environmental issues. Can you talk about what you mean here?
Yeah. And that's where that idea of complementarity comes in too, right? Like meeting, sort of both sides coming to a middle more than anyone abandoning a side that is science or art and narrative. There's this amazing book that I write about in my second book, Infowhelm, called Objectivity by Lorraine Daston and Peter Gallison, who are historians of science. But they talk about epistemic values, which I know epistemic is a jargony term, but basically the values that are privileged in a knowledge enterprise like science. And so, things like objectivity, things like quantification, causality, um, universality, things like that. So, also understanding those aspects of science are, I think, part of scientific literacy. But then on the others, the complement there, when I say that narrative literacy is so important, is I think goes back to earlier in our conversation that I've said this a million times, so I kind of like chuckle when I say it, like, um, data and facts alone are not going to, as you said earlier, move the needle. It's really through storytelling, understanding the stories, and all dimensions of the stories that move people or don't move people
Right.
to think about and act on an issue. And that can often be thought of as science communication, but it's so much more than that
Which is not a
because
very exciting term.
right, and there are people doing great work with that and using the arts for that, so I don't want to dismiss that way of thinking about things, but, there's so much communication, in the way it can be understood sort of, I guess in layperson's terms, can seem like a unidirectional, like we have this bit of information, we need to find the best way to get it out into people's ears and eyes, right? But really, I think narrative just introduces so much more complexity that there really isn't anything unidirectional or predictable about the way stories affect people.
Right.
So narrative literacy is not only it's, like, similar to scientific literacy, it's like, well, what are the stories already out there? And, like, how can those be, understood as providing a foundation for environmental relations and also thinking about environmental futures? But then it also means understanding how narratives work, and they aren't often so predictable
Right.
or, um, as one might think.
Yeah, and you say you write in your book that particular tropes, metaphors, and narrative patterns carry an affective charge that can activate environmental care when empirical studies alone cannot. And so, if I'm reading this correctly, you're not saying that any kind of storytelling can activate environmental care, but that particular kinds of storytelling can. And I just wonder if you could talk a bit more about that and maybe even describe some of these tropes, metaphors, and narrative patterns more specifically that you're thinking about.
Yeah, in eco sickness, one of the things I was interested in, as I said, their affect or emotion, the way that narratives generate and represent emotions, and how that does a lot of work on its own to affect how people are understanding an environmental problem and reacting to it. So, for example, the emotion of anxiety. Like this is a really powerful emotion in environmental representation of disasters or future disasters or climate change in general. Cultivating generating anxiety is something that a lot of, dystopian or apocalyptic environmental narratives will do.
Right.
Makes us anxious, makes us uncomfortable, makes us, uncertain. Anxiety is much more amorphous. Like, there might be sources for it, but it becomes this, like, pervasive, nebulous thing that's very hard to, like, solve or surmount. So anxiety is this emotion that I think is quite familiar from representations of environmental damage or crisis. And I look at Leslie Marmon Silko's novel Almanac of the Dead, which is a very, very large, sprawling, and challenging novel because it does depict a lot of the horrors of colonialism
Hmm.
and oppression and violence against indigenous peoples throughout the Americas. But it's a novel that really cultivates anxiety. And so I was interested in that as certainly a powerful way to help people think about problems, right? And to recognize them as problems. But then what happens to that emotion, right?
Hmm.
Like,
Hmm.
is this an emotion it might lead to care or to awareness, but is it an emotion you can act on? Or
Mm.
is it an emotion that actually shuts you down because it is so powerful, pervasive, but also overwhelming? So I think about, those and I also think about an emotion like wonder, very different,
Hmm.
like has a lot of positive associations with it. But, what are some of the environmental understandings and actions that an emotion like wonder can produce?
And another emotion you discuss is optimism, and you have this wonderful discussion of the split between environmental writers and activists on this question of optimism. So does hope fuel our ability to address ecological crisis, or does hope hinder our ability to confront very daunting realities? Or do these contradictory thoughts happen all at the same time? So here's one of my favorite lines from your conclusion. Smart grids, smartphones, and smart cars alone won't deliver us from our dumb ways of living so much as perpetuate them. So, can you talk a bit about this complicated, contradictory idea of optimism?
I think we often hear it with more through the, and you said this a moment ago, through the idea of hope. Because, I mean, often we conflate hope and optimism, but some people like to keep them separate. Like that optimism can be taken as an even more, a stronger expectation that things will just work out okay no matter what.
Right,
Whereas hope is often, I think, a little more mixed for at least within environmentalist circles. But hope is this emotion that I think drives you even if you don't know, or even if you think things will not work out okay.
right,
Um, there's a I think it's well, it's an anticipatory emotion, as they say, much like anxiety. Like you're sort of looking out into the future and imagining what that future might hold. And I think what's useful about the reason, at least I remain hopeful, even though I do not remain optimistic, I guess, is that it's something that can drive you in the present, right? Even if what you look at on the other side in the future, you're not really sure that it
right,
will all work out okay. Sort of in the day to day reminds you that there's something you care about that you want to preserve or improve. And so I think that for me, hope is about care, regardless of the outcome, and just how it motivates people to stay engaged, to form communities around issues, and to act even if they're not certain that action is going to make any great changes.
right. Yeah, well, within the environmental film world, I hear funders and others talk all the time about the importance of hopeful narratives, and they want films to go in positive directions and make people feel empowered to act rather than hopeless, or solely produce anxiety, like what you were saying before. But I don't disagree with that, but I question it. I think of a book like David Wallace Wells' The Uninhabitable Earth. That is a very anxiety producing book. That came out, what, last year? Um, but it maybe had some of the biggest impact on the environmental conversation last year, broadly, I'd say. I feel like that those modes of anxiety and fear and danger, can be very motivating also. So, it makes me think, do we need to hunt for a particular emotion, or do we need to cover the range of emotions?
Yeah. Yeah, and I want to, I think in some comments earlier, it might sound like I was saying there's something conclusive or definite, like, "Oh, we'll just find the right narrative, find the right emotion, and that will do X, Y, or Z," whatever your X, Y, or Z are. But I don't think that, yeah, it's not one of the, I think, important, aspects of emotional and narrative literacy is that the trajectories are not so certain. You might think you're writing a hopeful ending, or you
Right.
might think you're cultivating, actionable concern, when in fact you're deadening people or, overwhelming. You just nothing is so predictable in how people respond to a story. Um, there's often a desire to have a hopeful ending without a recognition of what has come before,
Right.
as if you end on a certain note and um, that is a teleology or an end point. that the whole narrative is driving toward. But actually, we have responses to everything that came before that an ending can't necessarily compensate for or redirect. So I think there's also that tendency to think like
Right.
if you end on hope,
Right.
something is accomplished. That I mean, I often use the phrase cocktail of emotions in my writing. I'm sure I used it in eco sickness because I do now for sure. Um, because it is this blend of things that, just like when you're making cocktail, if you don't drink, you're baking. Like, you wouldn't know from those ingredients, what necessarily would result, and often not the same thing does result. Um, Even if the ingredients are, you start from the same recipe and it's not the
Right.
same outcome.
So the title of your second book is Infowhelm. Um, that's one of those words that I never heard before, but as soon as I heard it, I instantly thought I knew what it meant. So
Oh, good. When I was first, shopping around that title, like, most people would say that, but n some people would say, "Oh, but why this
Right,
wonky,
right.
weird word?" But
So
so,
does it mean what we think
yeah.
it means? And how does it, and specifically why it was related to our ecological state of being? So I was wondering if you could talk about that a bit.
Yes, and I should say I did not coin the word, though I think I came up with it and then looked to see if other people had used
Right.
it, and, you never know how words, worm their way into your brain and you don't even know they're there. But yes, that word has been out there, but not so prominent as words like info fatigue or whatever it might be. But it is what you think it means, which is like being overwhelmed by a lot of information. Um, and the way I saw that pertaining to environmental issues, and actually the conclusion to eco sickness is a bridge, somewhat of a bridge into InfoWhelm, in thinking about how does data feel when we consume it, especially those of us in, you know, more privileged or wealthy media consumers in the West, in America, where you can be deluged by
Right.
news, Twitter, posts, feeds, whatever, all the time. Um, and that there's really like, what does it feel like to have all of that data, all of that information coming at you when it's not even really bidden? It's not like you're always even looking for it. And so InfoWhelm sort of acknowledges that phenomenon that so much is coming at us. And in the environmental sphere, I mean, especially if you are an environmentalist, you pay attention to these issues, but really even if you're not, there's a lot, just so much like information coming at us about, say, the percentage of extinct mammals, right? How many mammal species are extinct or bird species are extinct? All the data about climate crisis, whether it's like warming temperatures, um, ocean acidification, how much of the ice sheet has melted, it's
Right.
all this
It's like,
data.
how do you make sense of that?
Yeah, what do you do with that? I mean, what do you do with that not only as a way to understand the phenomena at maybe a, objective or straightforward level, but what do you do with that emotionally if you're an artist or
Right.
communicator? I don't just look at artworks in that book, but like, what do you do as a way to convey that information? Um, and what are you also evoking when you do that? And that's where the sort of like history and traditions
Right.
of science piece comes in.
And you talk about a deficit model of climate communication, which you say holds that the public's lack of information and comprehension is the primary obstacle to environmental action. So, what's wrong with this deficit model, and why has an abundance of available environmental information not led to an abundance of environmental action?
That deficit model, sociologists, psychologists, science communications people have really talked about this a lot. And it's an idea that, the problem is just that people don't have all of the facts, and if they just saw the complete picture of what's happening, say with climate change, or if it's something like toxic environments and public health, if they just had all the information, then surely, we would collectively act to make changes, or individually. Like, well, surely you would choose to drive less or fly less or whatever it might be. And, that model of like people are vessels and you just fill them with information, and, the outcome will be predictable, or maybe a factory model, right? You input some ingredients and then there would be this output. That just doesn't work. As you said, I think at the beginning of this conversation, there's a lot more to know, of course, but so much of the scientific phenomena of climate change, like changes to our geophysical processes resulting from carbon or methane in the atmosphere, a lot of that is known,
Mhm,
or it's
mhm.
known enough, right? And yet here we are in America, but really globally, here we are too. And so we need to account for all of the other factors that come into play when people are making decisions at individual and communal or governmental levels, when they're responding to that information. I mean, there's certainly an element, and I don't even get into this too much because I think there's been a lot of work about like denialism. There are books like and studies like Merchants of Doubt that just show like there's people denying the information and clouding it. But that aside, it's still not a direct like give people information and they respond this way. So we need to understand the emotional factors, issues of race and class and economics and geography and sex, sexuality, gender, all of these things that really play such an important role when people are responding to that information. And I think that's where the arts and different forms of cultural representation are so important.
Yeah, and I love in this book how, you're looking at these writers and artists who incorporate scientific information into their work, but the way they do it addresses both the limits and the necessity of knowledge derived from science. And one thing you write is artists are key players not only in making sense of climate crisis, but in making meaning from it. Um, I was wondering if you could talk about how making sense and making meaning are related but different.
Um, the sense part might be more like that picture that maybe uh, a science teacher or someone wants to paint of just what are the processes at play here? So, what does happen when we put so many greenhouse gases into the atmosphere? What does get affected? That's maybe, making sense of it. Because it is, I mean, it's not as if climate crisis is like straightforward, right? It's like terribly complex. So there's that sense making, just like, what is this thing? And how did it happen? And what is happening um, to the natural world and the social world in response? But then the meaning is okay. So what do people do with that knowledge? How does it become relevant to their daily lives? How does it not become relevant to their daily lives? How does it become, even if it feels irrelevant to their lives, how does it become a matter of concern if it about other people's lives and other beings' lives
Right.
that might be affected? So that, yeah, the meaning is just I think what we do with that, or different groups do with that information, and how we respond to it.
And let's talk about the God's eye view from aerial photographs and satellite imagery for a minute. In InfoWhelm, you say, in the 21st century, the air is the space from which millions access new places and perspectives on the planet. And this connects back to the first photographs taken of Earth from space, which emerged as the modern environmental movement was gaining momentum. And many people have argued that these photographs themselves helped catalyze the environmental movement, most famously Earthrise in 1968 and the Blue Marble in 1972. when astronauts rather than satellites were actually taking the pictures. And for the first time, many people saw the Earth not as vast and limitless, but as finite and fragile, floating in vast emptiness. And they wanted to protect it from harm. And you explore how literary and visual artists use aerial techniques to point out some of the problematic histories of the aerial perspective, and at the same time, show how it can be used to reorient our relationship to the earth and ecological crisis. Can you talk a little bit about this tension that emerges in these works?
Yes, certainly. So the view from space has been analyzed quite extensively in environmental studies. And so my thinking about it is extending off of that work. And it is often thought of as this catalyst environmentalism, but then there's this thought of how it is a position of mastery or control, right? Like, even if you see the fragility of the earth, it can also instigate a feeling of, well, this is something I can take care of, which is a good sentiment, but also this is something I have some control or some mastery over. So that's where that God's eye view. I mean, Donna Haraway is a very famous thinker about what that view, that God's eye perspective entails. This idea of mastery, objectivity as well, authority, those sorts of sentiments that are can be quite problematic um, for not only what one does to the environment, but how it impacts
Right.
different communities as well. And so the artists, I I was looking, and not just artists, also activists that I was looking at, they absolutely acknowledge the affordances, of the aerial, like how important, how powerful it is, how much it moves people and grabs people's attention. I mean, one of the activist groups I talk
Mhm.
about is this group called Sky Truth, which uses aerial imagery to sort of like to get purchase on illegal forms of extraction or the damages of extraction. They were really important during the Deepwater Horizon spill and seeing how the government was and BP were underreporting the extent of the spill. So there are all these things that the aerial vantage point can really do to um, hold people to account, to see what is happening on the ground. So these artists and activists, they acknowledge that. They don't wanna say like, "Oh, the aerial is." I think a term I use is like, they know they can't,
Right.
purify the aerial of its problems, but they want to still use it at the same time. And so they deploy it in this way that's very, I talk about it as being very self-referential. So instead of thinking of the aerial as like a clear window onto the world, they they show how it's what the smudges are, I guess, on that window. So how the aerial perspectives are deeply tied to um, military histories. They're often a privileged perspective that's owned or controlled by um, government and corporate partnerships. It's also the technologies that give one purchase on from the air or from space are also very have their own histories of militarization, corporate control, colonial control. And so they use these tools and at the same time recognize those histories. And those histories are sort of like reminders that this is not an objective perspective, right? That there's so many interested parties or forms of oppression and manipulation that go along with those perspectives. So the aerial is really important to talk about it because it's not something we want to get rid of or not use if we are environmentalists or environmental artists, but it's certainly something you want to be aware of just what its histories are, what its uses have been, and how those really travel with the technology whenever you're using them.
Yeah, definitely. And I love this idea of co-opting the tools for beneficial reasons. But at the same time, it makes me think of that famous Audre Lorde declaration that the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house.
I mean, that term master, right, evokes slavery, it evokes patriarchy, it evokes a lot of things, I think, for Lord. Um, and for my study, certainly evokes especially colonial histories, but it also just this general desire for mastery that often comes along with the scientific enterprise or thinking about solutions to environmental problems. So that phrase or that quote was certainly evocative and sort of traveling with me. And I do think, I mean, there are some who would say absolutely, like she's right. You do not use the thing, like if you're an artist, for example, you do not use a form, you don't use a medium, you don't use a tool or an instrument that is so tainted by
Right.
the very thing that you want to fight against. But I think that's quite hard.
It,
I
yeah.
mean,
Well, I think that it also taps into this plague of purity. I think that infects a lot of progressive movements where this assessment of any particular thing or object or perspective, is it pure or is it not pure? And if it's not pure, we have to stay away from it. And that's a really complicated and difficult way to assess the world, and kind of self-delusional in a lot of ways.
yeah, and I think of at what scale are we talking of the tool? Like, for example, the novel, right? I mean, you have something like the novel or poetry or documentary film. But then, you get more granular and you might say like the sonnet or the realist novel. Or I know less about documentary film, so I'm not going to have as good examples here, but sort of
Right.
like an interview based or
Observational.
right. So, you also, when you're thinking about tools, I think and I'm now like maybe deviating a bit from what Lord was talking about, but thinking about the representational and the aesthetic sphere, there are, I think, a lot of different levels at which you can think about that. Do you want to say like the tool of the novel or the tool of poetry, the tool of documentary or photography is sort of tainted for some reason, so you avoid it entirely? Or do you think about some of the more particular forms that you want to avoid or in fact like manipulate and call attention to, be really self-reflexive about the problems with them as you try to reorient them? And that was what I argue activists and artists. So I mentioned Sky Truth as an activist group using the satellite imagery in a very self-reflexive way that calls attention to the limits of the technology itself. But then I also look at a photographer named Fazl Sheikh who takes aerial, so not satellite, but aerial photography of the Negev Desert in Israel, thinking about the colonial oppression and manipulation of the environment in that region. I mean, he's actually interested in the displacement of Bedouin peoples, and that, I mean, he is certainly using aerial photography. He's using photography itself and acknowledges through his use of angle. He takes an oblique angle and the way he uses texture and shows texture and the layering of these pieces as in a way to sort of thwart our sense of visibility and transparency. If we think of often the aerial and the satellite image as offering this window or like offering an objective or transparent direct view of something, he's sort of using that tool of the aerial to show how it is incomplete, but certainly shows us a lot of things at the same time. And then going back to your point about knowledge versus feeling, like evoking a lot of feeling in that practice too.
Right, right. And back to this idea of sky truth versus ground truth, you know, um, Fuzzle Shakes, I mean, the vast majority of his work is portrait photography of, refugees and displaced people. So yes, he's bringing in that element of sky truth, but the vast majority of the work he's doing is ground truth. So there's something about contextualizing all these tools with other tools that can make them, I think, more meaningful, less problematic, less tied to an oppressive history.
And he writes, I mean, that, um his work, for it's called the Erasure Trilogy, this photographic project that does have, yeah, portraiture as well as aerial photography. He then collaborated with, A.L. Weissman, who's an architectural theorist and known for what's called forensic architecture in the human rights, domain. And they collaborated and they on this book called, Conflict Shoreline, which incorporates the photographs, but then they talk about how they are constantly moving between the ground and the air. So, the aerial leads back to the ground leads to the aerial or even the subterranean. And so that it is this, constant moving between positions, and that's something I also argue, for and demonstrate in that part of the book, that it's an argument for a multiplicity of perspectives rather than sort of the perfect or the
Right,
the
right.
objective perspective.
So in Infowhelm, you talk about the new natural history. These are artworks, as you say, that speak the same tongue as Euro Western natural history, but tell a story of ecological deficit. Can you talk about why these works interest you?
Yeah, so I that was, a section of the book that really arose from just being a reader and a watcher or looker-atter of environmental art and literature. So I started to notice that a lot of contemporary writers, so those writing and artists, producing work in the last 20 to 30 years were harking back to these traditions of natural history. And so those traditions, I mean, we know often many of us probably have know or been to natural history museums. And it's this practice of like classifying the natural world, naming it, putting it into categories, displaying it. And so things like, if you've heard of Linnaeus, very famous person who, naturalist who created the system of binomial nomenclature for naming plants and animals. All of these practices of basically ordering and classifying the natural world that arose during the Enlightenment period in Europe and then in America. And these were like responses to like greater access to the variety of things on the planet because of colonial, expeditions and endeavors. So it's like, oh, you're in Latin America, for example, and suddenly there are all these new plants, animals, and of course peoples, because the naturalist enterprise applies to peoples as well in this period. And so it's a way of responding to that abundance by ordering it, a way of understanding it and sort of containing it. Now, there's always slippage out of that container that, are really fascinating as well. So artists today were like referring back to and reproducing those practices. So, for example, you might have a poet who, I write about this poet, Juliana Spar, who has a poem in which, interspersed within the lines are the names of species that are on the endangered and threatened list of species for New York. And so they are these artists are using those techniques of representation and classification or ordering, but as a way to think through a loss of environmental abundance. So whether it's extinction or um, deforestation or radical changes to the land through, mining or dams, things like that. So they use those techniques, but as a way to get purchase on what is happening today and to really think through the histories of Enlightenment thought and colonial, um, um, colonialism that have produced the environmental degradation happening today.
You wrote an article for Yes magazine that explores the question of population control and limiting the number of children we have as an approach to addressing the climate crisis. And you discuss how readily calls for reproductive limits touch what you call the third rails of modern environmentalism: racism, eugenics, xenophobia, and even death dealing. For you, what does it look like to deal appropriately with the question of population control outside of the racist and xenophobic history of those things in the environmental movement? Or maybe how can we acknowledge or address the racist and xenophobic elements, past or present, of the environmental movement while still confronting the difficult question of reducing our global population?
So that piece is actually, well, it's part of a new thing I'm starting, but actually one where I don't know the answer to that question, and don't even know um, how to bring these two conversations together if they should be. Because, I mean, one of the things is not to say population control. So, controlling population has, at least in the environmental context, in the context of global development, colonialism, it's always been about controlling certain populations. It's been about advancing white
Right.
supremacy, and often it's been about reducing the fertility or of people who have disabilities. So really, like the whole, and I'm not the first to say this. A lot of people have talked about like the very phrase population control um, can't but evoke all of
Yep.
that. And so, I mean, that's I say a lot of people have talked about it, but I think that is not something like we all talk about, and so it's important to acknowledge that, and that history is very tied up in environmentalism, both past, like reaching back to the 19th century and further, and more present, thinking that the Earth has limits, or certain ecosystems have limits, and therefore we need to prevent people from coming into those spaces or limit the number of people reproducing in those spaces to preserve them. But again, that is always about some people, some communities, some races, some types of people being preserved at the expense of others. And so that whole like population control is just like tainted, right? So the question though is there are a lot of people who think about the relationship between um, their own reproduction and the fate of the environment. And this can be everything from I look around me and things don't look good. So why should I bring another being into a world that is so shattered and whose future I don't know? But then there are some people who think about, again, going back to causality, like, well, if I put another person on this planet, will they be, consuming more resources, emitting more carbon dioxide? Will I just be contributing even more to the problems that we're facing? And then there's certainly like other ways people think about this relationship between the environment and reproduction, and that can include actually, populations who have experienced genocide or near genocide, or um, whose ability to thrive on an environment and ability to reproduce have been significantly harmed. And so in that case, like having children is actually can be a response to that in the affirmative, sort of like shoring up those
Right.
traditions, creating that sense of connection between place and community. So I think for me, if I continue to think about this, um, that framing of reproductive justice is how I would think about it. And so that's not about limiting, deciding there's a limited capacity on the earth, and we need to stick to those limits by curtailing curtailing reproduction. but really thinking about the varieties of responses to having children, but also forming different kinds of family or kinship relationships in response to environmental degradation and particularly climate crisis. Because that reproductive justice framework is much more about thinking about people's um, bodily self determination, thinking about that there is no one right family, there is no one right so called number of people that we're seeking, but really curating the conditions for thriving for the widest variety of people and families.
Yeah, well, I see how connected it is to your other work in this sense of looking at something that is very tainted from the past. Whether it be aerial photography or um, classification, natural history and classification, and interrogating that. Do we need to reject that because it's tainted, or do we need to reorient it and use it in a different way with an awareness of how problematic it's been in the past. And one element of your essay that jumps out at me is your note about Project Drawdown, where they say, two of the most effective things we can do to deal with the climate crisis globally are to provide family planning universally and to increase education of girls. And those two things, shift much more towards the rights of women rather than the control of women, which is so much of what the history of population control has been. Have you thought about it in those terms?
The way I thought of the continuity of this work from past work was, or one way was actually probably more at a sort of like methodological level to be nerdy about it, which is, my work in eco sickness really venturing into um, medical discourse, the medical humanities, as it's called, and then also my interest in environmental issues. So I sort of saw it as like a return to some of those confluences of like the medical and the environmental, the bodily. Um, but I can see like I like the I like this continuity you're finding between, like, what are, these legacies of colonialism, of the Enlightenment, of racism, enslavement, like, they, how they really travel in, environmental scientific and environmentalist discourse in ways that we don't, some of us can too easily forget or, like, think that it's a part of the past or just discard entirely. So yeah, I like how you're drawing that connect it's often other people who see connections that you cannot see.
Yeah, well, it's actually it's through our conversation today that I connected that actually, which is interesting. And I'm gonna step back to InfoWhelm for 1 second, but I wanted to ask you, just see what your first thought was. So I love this term you use, the coming of mind plot, which is a play off of the coming of age plot. Um, can you tell me what is a coming of mind plot and how does it relate to climate InfoWhelm?
The coming of age novel or movie is something quite familiar, right? Like, you have a young person, usually someone at the cusp of adolescence or in adolescence, like coming of age, entering into maturity and all of the struggles there. And, often it's about like integrating into society or not, or resisting that. And so that is kind of a familiar trope or genre in so many different narratives. And I was interested in how there were some climate narratives where often adults who is having to like come to a sort of an environmental maturation or not, like suddenly comes to have to confront the facts, the data of climate crisis. And one of the, examples of the reason the text that made me come up with this idea was Barbara Kingsolver's Flight Behavior, her novel. And in that case, it's a woman, the protagonist is not versed in any real environmental or climate, knowledge, but there's this migration of butterflies that erroneously lands in her part of Tennessee, and suddenly she's starting to think about the facts, the existence of climate crisis, but this information comes into conflict with all many aspects of her social life, religion, her socioeconomic position, her gender, all of these things. And so, yeah, it's this confrontation and integration into a different, like, knowledge reality and the conflicts that happen and what results from that.
I wanted to go back to where we started with you delving into dance as a child in order to make you other than who you are and where you come from. I wonder what that project to remake yourself has led to and how it informs your view of your relationship to the rest of nature and our collective environmental predicament now. I know that's a huge question, but I just wanted you to kind of think through that that broad sweep of time to see if you had any thoughts about it.
Well, I guess starting from the more personal side of things, I mean, I was a good student as a kid, but nothing like exceptional, I think. Like the intellectual part of myself, I think I developed more after I decided or was kind of forced to see dance as not my future in terms of a profession. And I mean, that was a sad moment for me. And sometimes I still question that choice, even though despite what I wrote or said. But there was a certain like opening up, I think. Like, there was something also scary about thinking about being a dancer and how it takes up it takes so much out of you. It does that in the very young years of your life where you need to, like, you're
Mhm,
committing to
mhm, and can
something.
easily destroy you.
And yeah, it destroys most, especially ballet and some of these well, really all of it, but, like, it does have its damages for sure. And letting go of that was also sort of like, well, things can develop over time, right? Like, I don't have to know at 14 what I want to do and commit to it so wholeheartedly. And that's sort of like, I mean, I say this to people and they're like, that's bananas because, like, how much commitment does it take to become, get your PhD and become a professor? And, like, yeah, absolutely. But there was a lot of, like, I didn't know what I wanted to really study in grad when I got to grad school, and I discovered it along the way, and I think that receptivity is really important to me in thinking about not only, like, my relationship to the world around me, like, being out there and being receptive, to smells and sights and sounds and tastes sometimes, I guess, but just also being receptive to different positions on environmental issues, not being dogmatic, not seeking purity, like listening um, and learning a lot rather than, being so fixed in one's understanding. I don't know. I feel like that's very important for environmental conversations today, even though I have strong opinions and like,
Definitely,
and you know,
definitely.
fall on an ideological side and political side.
And do you still dance?
I do. I come into and out of it a lot more than I used to, and, so I stopped in college more or less, and then I came back to it really wholeheartedly for about, 10 years, and had this amazing teacher and community when I lived in San Francisco. And one of the upsides of the pandemic, which I know, like, we're sick of that phrase just as much as all others, is, um I'm able to take ballet classes with my most beloved teacher from my San Francisco days,
Mm,
and, granted from my
mhm,
living room, which
mhm.
is not the way I would prefer to dance. It's not a very big living room, but it sort of, like, clicked in my brain, like, "Oh, wait, like, they're probably offering classes I could take from my living room." So
Well, the other thing that clicks in your mind is this isn't ending anytime soon.
well, that's true. Like, I did think about the virtual dance class way at the beginning, and then I was like, "Ugh, I don't wanna do that. I love to move, like, I love to take up space, like, this is gonna be pathetic and
Yep.
confining. But then as the months wore on, I was like, well, better than nothing.
So, um, almost to the end here, I've one more kind of big question for you. Why does our struggle to create a more just and ecologically sustainable society need the environmental humanities?
Well, take the environmental humanities broadly, which is like thinking about those cultural, emotional, historical relationships to the environment. I mean, I don't see how you could think otherwise, right? Like, um, it's just there's no way. I mean, I'll take an example of like, conversations about climate reparations. That is like, do certain countries or community, states even, do they owe other nations or communities compensation for the damage that those communities are facing. Um, that question, I mean, there's an economic way of thinking about it. There's a sort of like quantitative, empirical way of thinking about it. Like, well, what are the actual harms to those people, whether it be health or loss of land or livelihood? Certainly, there are those perspectives on it. But so much of this is going to be thinking about the history of those relationships between countries or communities, thinking about just what the whole idea of reparations signifies for people. Like in the US, it certainly means something different with the legacy of enslavement than it might in another country that doesn't have that same legacy. I mean, all of these are, and also just, how would you tell that story of what people have experienced and what the future might look like for them? Um, those are all things that you just can't really approach without, whether you call it the environmental humanities, like that's what us professors call ourselves, right? Um, but you might not have that label for yourself, but those kinds of perspectives are just so essential for really any environmental decision or relationship that we're thinking about today.
Right, right. Yeah, I feel like it's this complicated thing sometimes to hold where we hear these calls for following the science, which I totally agree with. But I think a lot of what your work is pointing out is yes, we need to follow the science, but it also needs to be in the context of all this other stuff so that we can make meaning of it and that we can understand what to do with it.
Absolutely. In the very early days of the InfoWhelm project, I had, wrote an early chapter, and someone said, like, this could sound like you're questioning science, uh, you know, fueling a denialist position or a skeptical position, and that's why I say at many points in the book, like, this is about finding those complementarities, finding, you know, I borrow from a science studies scholar, Sheila Jasanoff, in this idea of paying how much deference do you pay to science? Like, not that you deny it, but where do you acknowledge its capacities and capabilities, and when do you say, okay, now we have to look at this other thing? So I think that's so important, especially now, in the midst of a pandemic or recovering from it in the future. But yeah, in so many of the areas we are challenged, it is about some degree of deference to science, but acknowledging its limitations.
Yeah, and I find it disturbing that at universities, the humanities are suffering terribly in terms of funding and students and everything else. And I feel like there's this sense that, if you understand science or technology or business, that's all you need to figure these things out. That's where the solutions lie. But it's 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 really dangerous to take that out of the context of the humanities more broadly.
Yeah, I mean, one of the, like, really sad, ironies of my day-to-day life is I can spend part of my day talking to you, or someone else, writing about the importance of the environmental humanities and what it means to me, and I think what it can bring to the world. And then part of my day talking to like maybe a graduate student just about how there isn't as much appreciation for that. I mean, which is not to say the only way of doing this work is within an academic context, but it certainly is not where all of the opportunities can be, right, within humanities disciplines or perspectives. So yeah, it's I don't know what would other much smarter, greater minds than mine are thinking about how to solve this issue or
Right.
what to do about this, but, it's something I live with every day of my life, I'd say.
Yeah, yeah. Well, people aren't necessarily making a lot of money off the environmental humanities or any humanities for that matter. So there's always that pull of money in other directions. So I've asked you to bring a quotation to read that's been particularly meaningful on your journey in life. Could you end the show by reading what you brought and telling the story of its significance to you?
Yeah, I think I'll read this one. It's from James Baldwin's novel, If Beale Street Could Talk, and he writes, "It's astounding the first time you realize that a stranger has a body. The realization that he has a body makes him a stranger. It means that you have a body too. You will live with this forever, and it will spell out the language of your life." And absolutely, there, he's thinking about race and being a Black body, a racialized body. And the idea of the stranger is often one of threat. That idea resonates through this quote as much as it also, I think, outside of that context, or in addition to that context, I think often about how our bodies travel with us even as they transform. So when he writes, "It means that you have a body too," like, and I actually think about the difference between having and being a body. But this is it's something that transforms, it's something that other people interpret, and they impose their interpretations and values on, and yet it's something that, right, is traveling with you as much as it's, undergoing those transformations and manipulations. And sort of the endurance of this, you will live with this forever, and it will spell out the language of your life. There's something I think there's an idea of entrapment there, and oppression potentially, but also like how the body can spell out the language of your life to me is just so evocative about especially someone who's interested in movement and like different expressive forms of the body. So I think like all of the registers of that just really stuck with me. And so there's some familiarity in that quotation, and there's some reminders of also, difference given my position as a white woman and the position of the characters and Baldwin himself. So, I mean, just one of the
Yeah,
most
and
amazing
being
American writers or writers, period. So also
yeah,
worth
yeah, James
worth
Baldwin's
mentioning.
amazing. Um, but it also makes me think of, being of this world. And, we spend so much time in our heads and dreaming about things far off, things in the future, things in the past, it's in a sense, this is like a declaration of mindfulness of like, be here now. We are of this world. And I see a lot of really profound environmental connections to that quotation as well.
Yeah, and also I think, like, you realize that a stranger has a body, like, again, I said that can be threatening, right? Like, the other's body can be quite threatening to you
Mm,
as a
mhm.
Black person, as a woman, as anyone, but, like, especially in certain positionalities. Um, but I think it's also a call to account, like you said, like a presence, that things do affect other people. There are other you're sharing space, whether that's a room or a city or a world with other people. Um, and that, so much ramifies on the body. I think of the body and the mind as, these are one. So yeah, I think it does have those sort of ecological resonances too.
And it connects to your work in eco sickness in this sense of the parallel between our bodies and and the broader body of the planet, makes me think of those things as well. Well, great. James Baldwin is fabulous. Thank you so much for bringing him into this conversation and for joining me today, Heather. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, John. This was an amazing conversation, tying together threads like sometimes I don't even tie together in my own life. So I really appreciate that.
Thank you so much to Heather Hauser. Go to our website at chrysalispodcast.org to see the quotation Heather read from James Baldwin and check out a list of her work, including InfoWhelm, Environmental Art and Literature in an Age of Data, and Ecosickness in Contemporary U.S. Fiction. Chrysalis is produced and edited by Gabriela Corba Vivas, with music by Daniel Rodriguez Vivas, designed by Unai Reguero, and mixing by Juan Garcia. Shub Jain is our web developer and assistant editor, and Isabella Nert is our social media producer and assistant editor. If you enjoyed my conversation with Heather, please rate and review us on your favorite podcast platform. Contact me anytime at chrysalispodcast.org, where you can also support the project, subscribe to our newsletter, and join the conversation.